Change. It's inevitable, right? How much change is acceptable and what a visitor's threshold for change is the focus of this PowerPoint today. I'll briefly address the idea of the limits of acceptable change, its importance and function, its origin, and its implementation. And we'll talk about how we'll use it in class. As we all know, or will come to know, change is inevitable. Even if we kept all of the visitors out of an area, resource conditions would change due to environmental processes. Even with very little use, some environments will change immediately. The question is, then, not how to stop change, but rather how much change is allowed and how much change to allow. For example, how many cars can drive on a scenic drive before visitors will find it unacceptable, leave, or take some other action? We need to recognize what we can do to manage and monitor changes so the social and environmental conditions remain within acceptable ranges. The Limits of Acceptable Change framework follows a 9-step process to address these important questions surrounding acceptable change. Now, like the recreation opportunity spectrum, there's no specific legislation that requires the use of the Limits of Acceptable Change framework. However, using the LAC does meet several requirements of the National Forest and Management Act. For example, it follows general planning guidelines, establishes a monitoring program, and where necessary, provides estimates of maximum levels of use. Conceptually, the LAC has its origins in social carrying capacity, the question of how many organisms an area can support. LAC moves from this basic question of how much use can an area tolerate to how much use is desired or acceptable. LAC does this by establishing what indicators are part of that desirable experience and the level visitors can withstand of those indicators. For example, if you were managing a primitive ROS class where the desired experience included solitude, you could monitor the solitude experience by creating and monitoring social, physical, and managerial standards. In this example, you might decide to monitor the number of trail encounters per day as a good social indicator of solitude in this ROS class. The standard or minimally acceptable condition you would seek out is that these trail encounters do not exceed 6 parties per day 95% of the time. Then, to know if the area is actually meeting this standard, you might conduct a visitor survey or do observation to see how many parties are encountered. You might also install a camera to review videos and track the actual number of counters on trails. Maybe by the time you're in the field, we'll all have cameras embedded in us. So, to identify the issues and appropriate indicators and standards to address them, LAC process evolved. This 9-step LAC process leads to the development of a set of measurable objectives that define desired conditions. Yes, it does involve some data collection and time, but it pays off in the end. So for first step, it's to identify the public's and the public's issues. For example, stakeholders in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness have previously expressed concern about Department of Homeland Security installing monitoring devices in the area, as they're not natural and could impact visitor experiences. Stakeholders are also concerned about mining in the area. Area issues are also important, and concerns might relate to distinctive features or characteristics of an area and the relationship of this area to others. Through identifying the issues and concerns, managers can identify features or values of particular concern to be maintained or achieved. They can also identify specific locations of concern. Once you know the stakeholder concerns, you also need to know the recreation opportunities you have in the area. We learned about the ROS and how you assign classes earlier in the semester based on social and environmental conditions. Now you can see its relationship to the LAC change process. You need to know what you have and what you want to know if you're keeping that acceptable. For example, in the wilderness, the encounters are very low, and this will influence how you manage the area. In the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in particular, group size is limited to 12 people, so this influences where people can travel and stay. The Boundary Waters actually has 4 ROS classes: pristine, primitive, semi-primitive motorized, and semi-primitive non-motorized. Each of these zones has different preferred conditions as detailed in their most recent 1986 plan, and I link you to this in the notes. So identifying and quantifying indicators for your desirable conditions are at the heart of the limits of acceptable change. In the steps 3 to 5, you consider what quantifiable indicators will guide area management, inventory the current conditions, and then determine how you can monitor these indicators in relation to what's acceptable. Indicators aren't new to us, right? In our own lives, body mass index is an indicator of good health. We measure our body mass index by dividing our weight by our height. And then we can monitor that number by comparing to what the CDC, or Center for Disease Control, indicates is healthy or acceptable. If we're out of the healthy range, we can manage our behavior to get in the healthy range, like by participating in outdoor recreation. In recreation, the idea and processes are the same, but there's no federal center for outdoor recreation quite yet. Rather than a list of indicators to rely upon, managers need to consider what really matters in their area and what they can measure within their resources to address the management objectives and stakeholder concerns. When done well, you'll end up with a list of measurable resource and social indicators you can inventory and monitor. You can read a really good example of this at the White River, which I've linked to, and we'll discuss some others in class. A good indicator is a measurable, manageable variable that reflects the essence or meaning of the management objective. Really, it's a quantifiable proxy for the management objective. So, for example, if the management objective relates to solitude and low numbers of encounters, you need to specify how you're going to measure encounters. It can't be really vague like encounters, because not all encounters are the same. Rather, the word encounters must be explicitly defined. So think about it. Does seeing a hiker on the trail have the same impact on your experience as hearing a hiker down the trail? Probably not. Does it matter what kind of other user you see on the trail? Probably. On the resource side of things, in the Boundary Waters, primitive area campsites, they determined that key resources indicators included the amount of exposed mineral soil and number of trees with roots exposed. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. So now, although there isn't a list of indicators that work everywhere, the Forest Service does have a number of encounters that they've used in various areas across the country. I've linked a few of these resources on the page for today, and we'll share a couple now. So for example, you might look at the vehicles at one time on a roadway, or the vehicles at one time on a trail if you're referring to ATVs. Similarly, you might think about the people at one time on an attraction or an attractive site, or the people at one time on trails. You could also think about the number of trail encounters with non-hiking parties. See how that gets more specific to talk about the type of encounter, as well as the number of campsite encounters per night. Here are a couple of examples from that Forest Service that I talked about. The number of encounters, the number of trees with bare roots exposed. So, and as you guessed, the next step is to inventory the indicators you just identified. How many encounters with non-hiking parties is the group having per day? The indicators specify the variables inventoried. They also identify the unit of analysis used to measure it. So once you've got the indicators for the experience you're managing for, as you see here, primitive ROS zone, seeking solitude, indicated by the number of trail encounters per day with motorized users, how do you know when things are acceptable or unacceptable? You've got to determine a standard. And that's the next step in the LAC process. Standards describe acceptable and appropriate conditions for each indicator in each ROS class. They also typically describe a range of conditions across ROS classes. In the Boundary Waters area, area wilderness, their example of the number of trees on the site with exposed roots is none to 25%. In a social example, their encounters include the number of visual encounters are 3 to 6 on the trail, 3 to 5 while traveling, and 1 to 2 while camping. So they have changed that based on where the visitor is. Note that standards express the typical situation. There may be times, very infrequently, when a standard is exceeded. In step 6, you'll identify what opportunity classes could and should exist in the area. These alternatives are based on the inventory collected in steps 4, the public issues identified in step 1, as well as the constraints of the agency regulations, of course. For example, perhaps the public is calling for more developed access in an area, moving away from the primitive side of the ROS, but your inventory reveals there's an endangered species. So in areas subject to a particular legislation, this actually happened in a class project a couple of years ago where we were considering visitor access on an island in the Mississippi River and discovered an eagle's nest. That sighting brought into play a whole host of issues and questions related to the availability for development and visitation at all. So, from this step of the inventory and alternative ROS allocations, you will develop a map of alternative ROS classes, which reflects both these existing conditions and any area issues. As the LAC manual details, after alternative packages of our opportunity classes have been identified, managers need to identify the differences, if any, that exist between the current conditions and the standards they need to maintain for that class. Understanding the costs and benefits of these different management actions will be important as they determine which alternative is really feasible. In step 8, then, they will evaluate and select the alternative that meets the issues, meets the regulations, and also is within the costs and benefits that they have. Once the alternative is selected, appropriate management actions are taken and monitoring ensues. Like we monitor our weight as a standard of health, visitor resource monitoring provides systematic feedback on how well management actions are working and identifies trends in the conditions that might require new actions. For example, if we measure the width of a trail before and after fencing, or we might measure a situation where visitors are concerned with density, like this case of kayaks on the beach at Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore. The results of monitoring will help evaluate program effectiveness and improve future programs. In the boundary waters, for example, they determined that if monitoring primitive area campground and it exceeds the standards, sites will be rehabilitated. Of course, ideally, the LAC is a linear process that happens as quickly and efficiently as possible. However, in reality, it's more likely that an inventory may spark a need to understand the desired conditions, and then the ROS classes are delineated. Whatever the case, indicators and standards that address area concerns and issues are the heart of the LAC. Now that you have an understanding of the importance of the LAC, its origin, and overall implementation, you may wonder how we'll use it in our class and beyond. So in class, you're going to go through the whole process. We'll go through examples in class, and your LAC has a great example. Your LAC reading has a great example at the end. I refer you to the Boundary Waters Management Action that I suggested earlier in this lecture, and it has complete LAC standards at this document I refer you to in the notes. Change is inevitable. The LAC process is a way to be proactive to address this change and manage for desirable social and managerial conditions. We'll use this in class to set indicators and standards for the ROS class you identify. See you there.